Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Caitlin Schneider, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. And this is our June webinar series for the Invasive Species Center. So a little bit of introduction here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation people on the lands known as Canada, and strives to show respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. We greatly appreciate the significance of the lands, waters, and all living things, and offer our gratitude to the Indigenous peoples for their care and for their teachings about our earth. Our relationships with Indigenous communities are important, and we will continue to listen and learn how we can be in good relationship with Indigenous peoples, the lands, and the waters, and all living things, and act accordingly. The Invasive Species Center respectfully acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robeson-Huron Treaty area. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization connecting stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and the spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, the economy, and society. On our website, we have a lot of great invasive species resources. So this is where you go if you're looking for best management practices, all about our species profiles on your invasive species, video resources, and many more. So you can visit that at invasivespeciescenter.ca. Along with that, you can also sign up on our homepage. This is where you can see our newsletter, our bi-weekly media scan, and event invitations where you can hear about upcoming webinars. The ISC also has a training program. It offers virtual courses on topics related to invasive species. There's currently 4 courses available which focus on different forest invasives, including our first aquatics course. So a 5th course is the marbled crayfish. So make sure to check that out on our website. You can sign up and receive updates for future courses as they become available. A few housekeeping rules is before we get started with today's webinar, there's a couple of things I'd like to mention. If you have a question, please put that in the question and answer box at the bottom, and then I can read it out following Gabriela's presentation. If it's in the chat, it might go unanswered, but if you do have technical difficulties at any time, type them in the chat box or respond to the email in that registration, and then we can resolve it for you. We also have enabled closed captioning. So if you'd like to follow along with that way, you can turn it on and with the closed caption button on your taskbar. Lastly, there will be a brief survey following the webinar. So if you could take the time to fill that out, we'd be greatly appreciated. And now on to Gabriela, so our presented speaker for today. The title is Understanding Plant Invasions Using a Traits-Based Framework. So I'm very pleased to announce Gabriela here. She's the assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Illinois in Chicago and focuses on machine learning and then continental scale ecological data. She did start and obtain her PhD at the Department of Forestry of Natural Resources at Purdue University 2018. And a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Commonwealth University 2022. And Gabriela, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. All right, so I think it's time for me to share my screen. Let's do that. I can find my presentation, which is here. All right, great. Okay, so can anyone tell me if you can see my screen fine? Caitlin, does it? It's full presentation. Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriela Nunez-Mir, and as Caitlin said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And today I'm going to be talking about invasive plants and their traits and how we can use the traits of invasive plants to understand the dynamics of the species, perhaps even being able to predict the dynamics of future invaders. Now, I want to give a little bit of an introduction about my research program and what we do in my lab. So I lead the MEC lab, or the Macroscale Ecology and Conservation Research Lab, over at the Department of Biological Sciences at UIC at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we focus majorly on invasions, plant and insect invasions. But what ties our research together is that it's all studied macroecologically. And that means lots of species at very large scales. So usually our work is focused on understanding invasions at the continental scale and the processes that occur across those scales to shape those patterns. And it's an important aspect of invasion that has been neglected, at least historically. Now, with the availability of new data sets, we're able to do this work more because we're able to synthesize perhaps contrasting findings in localized levels, being able to identify context dependency and those factors that drive context dependency, and even be able to produce generalizable findings across taxonomic groups and across geographical contexts and settings. But today we're going to be talking about traits and invasive traits at that. So why traits? Traits can tell us a lot about an organism. It tells us its evolutionary history and potential, its life history and strategies, its place within an ecosystem. And by traits, I mean any characteristic of an organism that is that can be directly measured, that tells us one of those things about the functioning of said organism. So we can think about things, characteristics of flowers or leaves, or how tall the plant is, its life history, its ecophysiological characteristics. So things like precipitation tolerances. All of those are directly measurable characteristics of a plant, that what is so powerful about them is that they can serve as proxies for processes that we can't measure directly. For example, we can use the height of a plant as a proxy for competitive ability. Competitive ability is a complex process. How do you quantify that? But you can quantify height because it's directly related to a plant's able to be competitive, at least in capturing resources like sunlight. So that is the power of using a traits-based framework to understand invasion. Now, in my PhD work many, many moons ago, and it's still some of my favorite work, we were able to predict whether a woody, non-native woody plant was invasive or non-invasive using only 6 key traits. Those traits were asexual reproduction leading, so invasive woody plants were more likely to be able to reproduce asexually. Water dispersal and bird and mammal dispersal were also more highly associated with invasive woody plants. Primary growth forms, so vines were more likely to be invasive, but trees, non-native trees, were more likely to be non-invasive. And with just these 6 traits, our model had an 86% accuracy in predicting whether a woody plant was invasive or not. And this is out of 800 and some plants in the United States at the moment. We got this information from the Forest Service. So from there, we started seeing, okay, we can use this to start characterizing invasiveness. And it's not a new thing. This kind of research has been going, truthfully, since the 90s, I would say, with very early foundations in the 60s with Baker's Law and some of Elton's work. But now, since we have more data, it's becoming more and more, we're building truly this subdiscipline within invasion ecology. Now, while we were doing this work, a question came up. I had a collaborator who was from Europe. And he kept saying, well, you have this species as a non-invasive, but actually it's invasive. And truthfully, if you look at this graph here, let me see if I can use a pointer. At this graph here, you see some spillage of the blues into the red, the blues being the non-invasives into the red. And he was suggesting, well, some of these species are actually invasive, but you have them labeled as non-invasive. And that had me questioning or asking myself, so what how do we even define an invasive? Right now in the United States, at least, and I'm guessing Canada is similar, the federal definition is about impacts. It's a species that is non-native that causes ecological, social, or economic harm, right? But in other places, this is defined differently. Now, I'm thinking a lot about what defines invasion success. So if I show you these two pictures, these are two federally listed invasive species in the United States. We have common reed, we have Australian pine on the left. And if I show you these pictures and I say they're invasive, you're like, yeah, I could see that because they seem to be forming monocultures, and you'll believe me, right? But what if I show you this image? Now, these are the distributions of these two species across the United States and Canada. And as you can see, the one on the left is only found in the tip of Florida and perhaps some areas in the West, whereas the one on the right, the common reed, is all over the place. So that paints a different story of what invasion success means. Can you say truly that these two invaders are just as successful compared to each other? Maybe, maybe not. So as I'm thinking about this, there were other folks in our field who were also thinking about this. This paper came out in 2021, and I was so excited to read it because it indicated, there's other folks that are thinking like me right now. And this paper breaks down invasion success into 3 dimensions. So you can either be very locally abundant, so that's success in one dimension. You can be very widespread, like the previous slide. You're all over the continent. That's successful in that dimension. Or you could be a generalist, which means that you can thrive in lots of different habitats. If you do all 3, if you're successful in all 3, then you're a super invader. But you could be good in one of those aspects and not the other. So just to drive this idea home, you can have a species like tree of heaven, which is abundant, generalist, and widespread, so a triple threat, and it's found in over 2,000 counties, at least in the United States. It was introduced in the late 1700s. Let's compare this plant and its characteristics to a plant like Suriname cherry, which is also abundant, also a generalist, so it's a winner in 2 categories, but it has a restricted range. It's only found in Florida at the moment. It's been here since the 1900s, so it's had plenty of time to disperse and expand its range beyond there, but it hasn't yet. So what plays into that? And obviously we could all have our ideas, but let's test that, or at least our ideas to test that empirically with data. So we proposed this project that was actually successful. So we are currently working on it. Definitely stay tuned. Planning to have some stuff out by the end of this year, next year. And we were thinking, okay, so what are all the mechanisms that could be driving invasion success across those 3 dimensions? So we have things like niche breadth, how broad the environmental tolerances of a species is. We have things like aggressiveness, as we know that lots of invaders can be. That speaks to competitive ability. We have adaptation ability and being able to fit in lots of different areas and different environmental contexts, or able to be plastic once you are in an environmental context that might not be what the plant was expecting or adapted to originally. How about self-reproduction or dispersal? In the previous work that I've done, we saw that asexual regeneration was quite important. So maybe that plays a role here as well. So let's talk about data that we're going to use to explore which of those mechanisms may be associated with success in either of those dimensions. And I am very proud to say that I have a really fantastic group of undergraduate researchers that have been working on this since 2021, putting this wonderful database of invasive traits together. So we have a database for, I think right now, over 900 non-native, potentially invasive plant species in the United States, across over 25 different species traits. So we have morphological traits, some reproductive traits, in collaboration actually with some folks at UMass. We brought some dispersal traits as well. And all of these data were collected from sources like fact sheets put out by probably, we did not use the Invasive Species Center, but similar to the Invasive Species Center, who are putting out extension and outreach fact sheets with species level information about these plants. But the thing is that they're out in the internet and you can look them up, but they're not in in a format where we can use them for research. And that's what these students have been doing since 2021, just reading and data entry into a spreadsheet. And this work is now under review in ecology, so it'll be usable for public use, hopefully next year, depending on how the review process goes. Now, for the dimensions of success, we're collaborating with, again, our friends over at UMass Amherst, specifically Dr. Bethany Bradley's lab. They are on their side working. They were also thinking about the dimensions of success, and I know that they have a paper currently under review about it. So we are going to be leveraging their data on these plants and how they are classified, these invasive plants in the US, across these 3 dimensions of success. Now, this graph that I have here is also because I'm a very spatial person, as you can imagine. So the way that I envision these dimensions of success, I also think that they're spatial dimensions of success. So for example, if you're very abundant, then you might be very successful at the neighborhood scale. If you're widespread, then you are successful at the macro scale. And if you're a generalist, then you are successful at the landscape scale. At least I like to see it that way. Now, being from a macro scale lab, the preliminary results that I will be showing you today will be focused on that scale, which is the one that I was initially the most interested in, although we're moving forward to look at all 3, success at all 3 scales. But so far for the macro scale, success, in the macro scale, we find that niche breadth may be the mechanism by which invaders become widespread, so by which they become successful at the macro scale. So these are some short results of that, and these are preliminary results, as I said. So we found that niche breadth, the principal component, which is a combination of all those traits for that mechanism that I said, it's a statistical method to be able to reduce the dimensionality for data. It shows that that is out of these 4, the most significant. We also found an effect of how long the plants have been in the continent, which, as we know, if you've been here for longer, you're more likely to have a larger extent. So we have to include that just to account for that factor. But digging in a little bit deeper into those results, we find that if we look at the factors within niche breadth that we're able to predict or to model, well, the number of counties in which these plants are found, that's going to be our proxy or representation for how successful they are at how widespread they are, how many counties they're found in the United States. We find that hardiness zone range is quite important. So the broader their hardiness zone range, the more likely they are to be found in more counties in the United States. So the more widespread these plants are. And hardiness zones are a classification of areas continentally given their temperatures. It's a proxy for the temperature tolerance for that plant. So if it's very hardy, if it can resist very cold temperatures, or even if it can do well in very warm temperatures, if it's adapted for, you're losing more water when you're in warm temperatures, then it has a broad hardiness zone range. And those plants were actually found to be more widespread. And this preliminary result comes from 275 species that we had data for, and it was able to predict 15% of the variation in the number of counties these plants were found, which for one single variable in ecology, that's a pretty good amount of variation explained just for one thing. Now, we found that elevation range also played a similar effect on the number of counties these plants were found. And it seems to indicate, these preliminary results at least, that it has something to do with temperature, right? And being able to subsist in a broad variety of temperatures, or being able to find refugia up in mountains. So you can go to places that are very different elevations to be able to find a niche for yourself. So this preliminary study was done with 291 species, and elevation range explained 9% of that number of counties of how widespread these species were. So still, it's a little bit lower than hardiness zone range, but still quite good. Now, eventually, the overarching goal, other than, you know, advancing invasion ecology, is to someday be able to, or not someday, but to use this information to be able to identify America's next top invaders, right? And it could be for the entire continent. We're focusing on the United States, however, because that's, you know, the data that we have. But we are hoping that we can put together a list, a watch list of species that have been introduced recently, so they don't seem so bad, but that could become bad in the future. And now, every time I give this talk, I like to give people a little bit of a taste of what that could look like. So using those preliminary results that we saw, that hardness zone range and elevation range were important, I've pulled out a species that could potentially become quite widespread across the continent in the next 50 to 100 years. So Japanese shaft flower, Acherontis japonica, although I believe the scientific name might have been adjusted recently. It's been in the United States, at least, I think North America, for the last 38 years. It's first found in southern Illinois and northern Kentucky. Now that one has a really wide elevation range and a wide hardness zone range. So it's one that we predict could become widespread. And the funny thing is that each time that I have shown the species, or at least a lot of the times, as a potential, someone has come up to me, a practitioner that's already dealing with it, a colleague of mine over at Urbana-Champaign, said that he grew up with it, seen it in southern Illinois, and they say, oh, I was so surprised to hear that you talked about this species because it's so bad at the local scale, right? So it could be so bad for all of us in the next 100 years if we don't put it into watch lists and keep surveillance efforts up with this species to be able to slow its spread. So that's an example of a species that could become widespread in the future. Now, that's about defining invasion success, using traits to define invasion success. But frankly, we can use traits for many other things, or at least I'd like to hope so. And I've been trying to figure out what else can we do with this traits-based framework. And one of the things we thought was, okay, let's turn our eyes away from success and defining what's invasive and what's not invasive to impacts, and see if we can use these traits to understand the impacts of these invasive plants. So we looked underground. And we thought, okay, can we use traits to understand impacts of invasive plants and soil microbial communities? And a big reason why we wanted to tackle this problem was because there are a lot of conflicting findings right now on the effects of invasive plants on soil microbes. And some of that is because below ground traits are really hard to quantify. So we know a little bit, or we know quite a bit actually, of how the leaves of invasive plants affect the leaf litter, and then how those effects cascade to soil microbial communities. We know a little bit about nitrogen fixation, and we know a little bit about allelopathy, which is a word I've never known how to pronounce very well. So I hope that was it. But we don't know what else invasive plants could be doing, and results at localized scales have been quite contrasting. So we wanted to see if we could employ a macroecological perspective to this. So as I said, below ground traits have been relatively underexplored. We know about leaves, and we know about allelopathy and nitrogen fixation. But look at all these different roots. Now, these are not actual pictures. It's an illustration that I did on BioRender. But it's trying to be faithful. You can imagine that the roots of invasive plants or of different plant species can look quite different, and that different morphology and function of these roots could have also their distinct impacts, especially when that invasive plant is very different from the resident plants. It could have an impact on soils and, in response, soil microbial communities. And the ways that roots may change soils are plenty. Most importantly, through bioturbation, so the mechanical moving of soil and changing physical soil properties. We've got root exudates. So a lot of times these roots expel chemicals with different purposes. It could be for defense. It could be to attract or to mobilize nutrients. It could be to attract symbiotic microorganisms, which is the third way that they can affect soil microbial communities, by recruiting their own symbionts. So to look at this work, my collaborator, Dr. Matt McCary over at Rice University, and I collected data on microbial composition and plant species under cover for 377 plots from NSF Neon, which is a national network of plots that is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, and they collect all sorts of data, which makes my job really nice and easier to have someone else doing all the work of collecting all this wonderful data. So from these plots that go from, as you can see, Alaska to Florida to Hawaii, we got a list from all of those plots combined of over 1,800 native plants and 187 invasive plant species. Now, for each of those plants, we tried to collect data across 9 different root traits. So we had morphological stuff like root diameter and root tissue density and specific root length, but we also had things like root chemistry, such as roots carbon and nitrogen concentration. We had then more organic or more ecological, characteristics such as root mycorrhizal colonization as well. And we leveraged these wonderful databases to get that data, Groot, Try, and Fred. Now, if any of you have worked with traits data before, you'll know that there's going to be a lot of missing data. It's actually quite new from the last couple of decades, these efforts to create these large traits databases. So we don't have data for all of the species that we had. So we had to leverage a method called imputation, phylogenetic imputation at that, which is an advanced form to be able to plug in missing values. And so the final data set was only 787 species, 693 native, and 94 invasive. That's post-imputation. Now we wanted to address 3 questions. The first one, are the roots of invasive and native plants different? Because at the end of the day, if they're not different, then why would we expect them to have a different impact, invasive plants that is, on our community? The second, are the microbial communities of invaded and uninvaded plots different? Now that gets to the outcome. Are we even seeing differences in soil and microbial communities when they are exclusively native versus when they are invaded? And the third one connects those two. Are root traits contributing to those impacts that we see in soil microbial communities, assuming we see them, which we did? And as we know, and as I have mentioned, we know that leaves have an effect. We know that allelopathy has an effect. But these root traits that I pointed out, are they contributing to any differences that we see? So let's go with the first question. We performed a series of phylogenetic linear regression models, which is just a model comparing 2 groups, in this case, invasive and native, while taking into account that these species are related to each other. And we found from those analyses that invasive and native plants differ in specific root length and in their root tissue density. Basically, we're starting to see here that the roots of invasive plants tend to be really fast growing and cheaply made. So lower root tissue density and higher specific root length, that's kind of what we're seeing here. They just put out roots that are very good at acquiring resources, so highly competitive roots. So that was our first question. We saw that those 2 are different. Let's move to the second question. Are the microbial communities of invaded and uninvaded plots different? And for this one, we compare the microbial composition of plots with varying levels of invasive plant cover. So we had the highly invaded plots that had more than 50% invasive cover. We had the moderately invaded plots, which had more than 0, so had at least 1 invasive to up to 50% invasive cover. And we had plots that were not invaded at all, were completely native. So we compared these 3 groups. And we wanted to compare them in 2 ways. First, we wanted to do an equal multivariate dispersion test, which basically tells us within these groups, within those 3 circles, colored bubbles that you saw before, how different are the plots from each other within each group. If there is some ecological thing going on with invasives, you would expect all of the plots in each of those groups to be very similar, right? Now, or more similar to each other than they are to the plots in the other groups, at least. Now, the second test that we had planned was a permutational analysis of variance. And basically what that tells us is in this multivariate space of all of these microbes, remember that we're not just comparing across one thing, we're comparing across all of the microbes in those plots, the microbial composition. How do these three bubbles differ from each other? Now, the first test, we did it because we were interested, but also because it's a check, a statistical check for the second one. So if the first one is not passed, then you can't do the second test. And we actually found that we did not pass that first test. So we couldn't do the second one. But that failure in the first test actually told us a lot. Basically, we failed the test because the level of dispersion of plots within each of these bubbles was different. And I'll show you a little bit of what that means. If you can see here, this ordination. So the space, this is microbial space. Each different axis represents a group of microbes that has been simplified for the sake of the ordination. So we see that those plots that are native or non-invaded, they're all over the place, which means that the native plots are all very different from each other. Now we would expect that because we have plots from different types of ecosystems, forest, agroecosystems, grasslands. We also have plots for all over the place. Hawaii, the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest. So we would expect those plots to be quite different in their microbes. Now, if we turn our eyes to the red plots, which you can almost barely see, they're grouped all very close together, which means that the soil microbial communities in invaded plots are very similar to each other. No matter where they are, and no matter what type of ecosystem, they're very similar. So we see a similar pattern, sorry for the redundancy, we see a similar pattern with moderately invaded plots. They seem to be more similar to each other, all the yellow dots, with some differences, although keep in mind that these moderately invaded plots, they could have like one invasive, so it could be acting more as a native plot. But in statistical, we wanted to confirm that statistically, and we saw that, yeah, if we're comparing at the level of dispersion, so how separated these dots are between the moderately invaded and the highly invaded, we see it crosses the zero line. So there's no significant difference in the dispersion of those two. However, when we compare not invaded to highly invaded, yeah, there is definitely a difference in the dispersion of those two groups. And less strongly, but still significantly, we see a difference between moderately invaded and not invaded. Okay, so that was two. We saw that the roots of invasive and native plants are different, and we saw that the soil microbial communities of invaded and uninvaded plots are different. So now we're left to ask, well, are the root traits contributing to these patterns? So we attacked this two ways. We did variation partitioning, which basically it isolates the relative effects of native and invasive plants or plant roots, structuring so microbial communities in the same plot. So we have this plot which has both natives and invasives. Let's see which roots are controlling or modulating those soil microbial communities more. And the second test was a longitudinal analysis. Basically, we took the same plot from 1 year to the next and saw how changes in the roots of that plant, in the invasive roots of the plant in those plots, change soil microbial communities from 1 year to the next. So we're isolating those effects by looking at the same plot from 1 year to the next. So our results show that, yes, actually the roots do play a role. We saw that invasive roots explain almost twice the variation in soil microbial communities compared to native roots, so 27% to 12%. Now, very interestingly, when you put all of those together, it's almost 40%, or about 40%, the influence that plant roots in general, play on shaping soil microbial communities. Now, for the longitudinal test, we saw, I'm going to direct you to the very specific results that will be illustrative here with CN ratio. if we looked at the adjusted or squared, changes in CN ratio in the same plot, in invasive roots, in the same plot from 1 year to the next, explain 20% of changes in soil microbial communities. Again, in ecology, seeing this from a single variable is quite, it's substantial. Similarly, for specific root length, which we know is different, or we saw before in previous results that they were different between invasive and native plants, we saw that it explained about 6% of that variation. So these two traits in the same plot from 1 year to the next were working to change those soil microbial communities. Now, the implications of these results are that we have seen that root traits of plant invaders tend to have faster growth, and they're cheaper, and because they're different in these ways, they're modifying the soils in a way that affects the growth of soil microbes, to the point that invasive plants are altering these soil microbial communities in similar ways, producing these homogeneous microbial communities regardless of ecosystem type and region, geographical region. And these homogenized microbial communities may be quite problematic because they may result in the loss of important functions, especially at large spatial scales, such as things like decreased resilience to disturbances and the loss of microbial mutualists and beta diversity. So yeah, I'm sad that I ended in a bad note, but let's move to a sadder topic, climate change. Which, as I said, I've been thinking, what can we do with traits to understand invasive? So that was a story about how traits can be used to understand impacts of invasive plants. Now let's see how traits can be used to understand how invasive plants are going to react to climate change, specifically their ranges. So similar to native plants, the ranges of invasive species are expected to shift, expand, or contract with climate change. Now, we know that invasive plants are hypothesized to have an advantage, displaying larger potential range expansions with climate change. So you can see the red here. You see more expansions than natives, although you also see more contractions. And seeing that difference, actually, it tells us that not all invasives are going to react the same. And species trait may allow us to identify which invasives will be actually benefited by climate change and which will not, and why. So for this work, we had to get traits data again, as we do. So we used some of that data that my students put together from the traits database. That was for the niche traits, hardness zone, precipitation, elevation. We wanted to focus on functional and niche traits that were indicative of drought resistance, environmental tolerances, and heat resilience, and perhaps long distance dispersal as well. We also used specific leaf area, maximum leaf area, and dispersal for those. For the range responses, we leveraged some published work from, again, the Bradley lab over at UMass, and our co-author, Dr. Jenica Allen, who is also contributing to this work and collaborating with us. They published species distribution models for 811 invasive plant species. So we leveraged that to see, okay, how the traits tie to those predicted changes in ranges. So we have 14 species distribution models, 1 for the current range of the invader, and 13 for 13 future potential range estimates on their climate change. And we just kind of merge all of those together to see, okay, where is the species going to be in mid-century under climate change? Now we wanted to focus on 3 responses. Centroid shifts, so if the range is moving, it's centroid. Area change, if it's increasing mostly. And then specifically within the US, if they are expanding or contracting. Now, we use phylogenetic linear regressions again and machine learning to better explore these patterns. And now the fun stuff. So for century shift, we found that invasive plants that were least likely to shift their range, so to stay exactly where they are, had broad current distributions in the United States, so they're already quite widespread. They have narrow, low elevation niches, so they prefer low elevations and do not stray far from that. They prefer extreme precipitation regimes, so either very dry or very wet, have an intermediate SLA strategy, so they're kind of conservative, kind of acquisitive, and are capable of long distance through animal vectors. Now, for percent area change, we see a similar story, that those that were least likely to expand or increase in range size also had broad establishment across hardiness zones. So they were very tolerant, so they won't continue expanding, possibly because they're already quite widespread. They're tolerant of colder climate, so that points out that maybe if they like the cold, they won't be able to expand under climate change, which is kind of obvious, but it's nice to see it with data. They also have intermediate SLA strategies, so they're right in the middle, not very competitive and not very resource conservative either. And they have narrow elevation preferences, so they can't really leverage going up a mountain if they need to. Now, finally, for a lot of folks in management and practitioners like to hear is, okay, so within the United States, who are going to be the invasive winners and invasive losers of climate change? Who do we have to keep an eye out for? We found that within the United States, plants that are most likely to expand had a small invasive range size to start with. So those that we might not be super concerned about yet, at least at the federal level, have been adapted to warmer climates. Makes sense, right? Because climate is warming. They have an intermediate SLA strategy, which kind of contradicts what we saw before. But this is kind of a different perspective to the question. Basically, plants that, again, are not very acquisitive, but are not very resource conservative either, which means that they are right in the middle and maybe more adaptable. And those who have tolerances of low or very high elevations. So those that could access climate refugia up in the mountains if it gets too warm at low elevations. And with that, we see that we can use traits also for this purpose. We learned that broad environmental tolerances and trait systems that balance persistence with that opportunistic expansion will promote stability in a warming world. Now, invasive winners in the US of climate change will be warm adapted, or are likely, to be warm adapted, elevation tolerant, and have those intermediate leaf strategies. Those losers are going to be the cold tolerant environmental specialists. Now, these patterns suggest a tropicalization of the invasive flora of the US, which could be quite problematic, as it may accelerate changes in plant community composition and function, with cascading impacts from these novel interactions from these new plants across trophic levels. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all my lovely co-authors and collaborators, that I would not be able to do this without them. And for the great folks all over those data that are working on these databases, which again, I could not do my work as an indoorsy ecologist if I didn't have their data. And to my funding sources, the Waldorf Foundation. And with that, I'd love to open the floor for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabby. So I have a question coming in from Kathy. I'll read it out and then let me know if you want me to repeat. In your work, vegetative reproduction and long distance dispersal, those two stood out as key traits. Have you considered integrating evolutionary liability, such as how quickly traits evolve, as a predictive factor?
Yeah, hey, that is a great question and a great perspective, which is very out of my wheelhouse. It's funny that this question came out, and I'm sorry that I'm getting chatty about this, but I have a colleague who's an evolutionary biologist, and we approach these questions about invasion so differently because we're in completely different time scales, at least how I see it. That's not even mentioning how you methodologically approach those questions. So while it is super interesting and I'm sure plays an important role, I personally don't have plans to study that because it's outside of my wheelhouse, but I would love to read if folks are doing that kind of work and what they find, because I'm sure it's important as well. Oh, actually, I'm going to add something to that. There is evidence that genome size affects invasion success as well. And that is quite corroborated in macroecological work and in some other preliminary analysis that I didn't show today. But that is as far into the genetics evolution world that I'm willing to go. Oh, I can't hear you, Caitlin. You're muted.
Thank you so much. Oh, I thought you could lip read for a second. I was like, that's good. Okay. Kathy asked, are trait-based models, particularly those identifying vegetative reproduction, long-distance dispersal, and broad climatic tolerances, show strong predictive power for invasive spread? And I think it's related to ornamental plants in horticulture. So a lot of ornamental plants are selected exactly for those traits. And how could you screen for like cultivars in the trade before they become problematic?
Yeah, great questions. And I'm going to tackle a couple things there. And I'm sorry if I get a little bit too specific. But so spread is another dimension that I did not mention because it's also hard to quantify. And by spread, we usually talk about how fast they move out, right? And it's an important aspect of invasion, of course, across the landscape, not just, I mean, there's different scales that you could look at that, the range as well as expanding. Now, we were talking about ornamentals. In other preliminary results that I did not share, we do find that whether the reason why they were introduced or the pathway in which they were introduced does play a role on success. And I want to say not at the macro scale, but in the abundance, I believe it's the abundance dimension at the neighborhood scale, that ornamental plants, it tends to predict that there will be more successful at the neighborhood scale. And definitely that it's because those traits are being selected for that make them invasive. But I can't remember what the rest of the question was. Sorry, but yeah, those things are related to each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Brendan asks, thank you for the presentation. So big thanks, Dr. Nunez-Mir. Really interesting stuff. What implications could trait-based data on invasive species have for management and control decision-making? Could this theoretically help predict early management strategies that could be effective for addressing invaders?
Yes, so thank you for that question. I'm kicking myself now because I forgot to mention all the management implications and our plans to support data-driven management practices. So the traits are so great because because they're measured, right? And they tell us something that we can use to predict. So for the first part of this talk, definitely that watch list. We are wanting to, or we will put together more localized lists, at least for our Illinois Invasive Species Council, so that it could go into our state's early detection and rapid response programs. Because they have their list and we will just submit candidates given the traits that we have identified as important. And we're ranking this list. We'll have a national list and then we'll have a localized list for Illinois at least. That will be ranked by how closely these plants are at the moment, how close, and also the climatic suitability to Illinois. So that's one way by informing invasion surveillance and EDRR programs, but also with climate ready invasion management practices. I think that we can help inform those as well by pointing out the invaders that will be benefited by climate change. And that is kind of a more forward-looking, proactive way of targeting invasive management. And I think that everyone agrees with that. And it's where, at least what I've seen from management in the US, management groups, that they're moving towards that more forward-looking, climate prepared, climate ready management practices.
Okay, we have a lot of thank yous in the chat, but Leslie put it in the Q&A. Great presentation, especially with respect to addressing of traits that are seldom considered in studies, but logically should be. And Dolores says, would you provide more details on how you handled missing values in the data sets?
Yes. So the missing values so the work in the root traits. So I mentioned that we use phylogenetic imputation. Now that's a little bit of newer advances in macroecological research. I think that in other fields they've been more comfortable with different imputation practices. At least when I was being trained, it wasn't really widespread, that practice. Now, as we try to do more traits work, the field as a whole, it's just a pervasive issue, right, of the missing data. So studies have found that phylogenetic imputation, so this is an imputation method that takes into account the phylogenetic relationships among species in your data set. So it's borrowing data from phylogenetically related species, and it also takes into account correlation across those traits. So it's borrowing information in those two ways to produce ecologically meaningful or ecologically informed, biologically informed trait estimates for plants for which you have missing data.
Thank you. So Tom Smith asks, in the soil microbiome studies, did you include mites and then find any species of mites common to be used as indicator species?
Yeah, we did not include mites. I don't think so. No, we did not. I know for sure. But what I can also tell you about some limitations of our work that we are planning on addressing in future work is that the way that we described the soil microbial communities was quite coarse. We use something called PLFAs. Sorry, I almost forgot. I'm not the soil ecologist. My collaborator is. PLFAs, which very broadly tells you groups of microorganisms like negative gram bacteria and saprophytic fungi. So it doesn't go as finely, the taxonomic resolution is not so fine. But it could be, we honestly did want to include other taxonomic groups, but we couldn't get data, and I am limited. I go where the data goes.
Awesome. Vicky says, fabulous presentation. I'm wondering if these trait-based models have space for concepts of naturalization, example, where in the short, medium term, they might show invasive tendencies, but in the longer term, reach equilibrium with the ecosystem.
Also a great question. So our species lists include a mix of species, those who are recent introductions and those that have been established for a very long time, those, the iconic invaders that have been here for over 100 years. Now, we try to take into account where in that stage those species are by including that residence time variable as a covariate into our models, and that tries to minimize the effect of these plants being in different stages of invasion to see if we can get generalizations despite them being at different stages. Now, if we were to separate recent introductions from older invaders, it's likely that we might find patterns that differ between those two groups, but I haven't done that. That's a good question.
Awesome. So Casely says, great presentation. Do you think collecting the functional traits from literature and using for an analysis is appropriate? And which traits do you recommend for the analysis?
Oh, can you repeat that? I think I missed that part of it.
Yeah, no problem. I think collecting the functional traits from literature and using for an analysis is appropriate. And then which traits would be recommended?
For what's the analysis for? I think I'm missing a
little Maybe we'll skip over that one, but Kayla, if you do have that specific question in more detail, we'll provide an email for Gabby.
Yes, please send me your emails. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, lots of questions actually coming in. So tons of thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. Does this traits-based framework apply to invasive aquatic plants?
Yeah, I am sure you could use it with invasive aquatic plants. That is a different world for me. I'm a terrestrial ecologist. Every time people ask me about aquatics, I get a little stumped because processes in the aquatic realm are a little bit different from terrestrial. So what determines success for aquatic invaders might be a little bit different than what determines success for terrestrial invaders, and there might be some commonalities. We did not include aquatic plant species, but if you want to take on that research, I will stay tuned because I would love to hear what happens with aquatic plants.
That would be a good like collaborative and connect together. But yeah, so the potential relationships, if you have any thoughts on traits to invasional meltdown. So in other words, are the traits of certain invasives that often lead to aiding the establishment of other invaders?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So not to get chatty, but a lot of these questions are things that we are thinking already. So I get really excited when I hear them. So for the microbes work, that was a big question in our minds. Are the invasive roots affecting the microbes, or are the microbes affecting the invasive plants, or in the sense that did an invader from before change the microbes and then that leads to more invaders? We wanted to look at that feedback loop. We were not able to, but I have the feeling I really want to test this in a field, in the field, really, or at least experimentally, because to me it is a big missing part of the puzzle. It's that feedback, whether it exists or not. Now, I had a student that was working a little bit on invasional meltdown, and he didn't find this pattern. So he explored 2 species, reed canary grass in wetlands, garlic mustard in forests. And for reed canary grass, he found that no invasional meltdown because it's so aggressive that honestly it takes over, it decreases the richness and abundance of other invasives, as well as native plants. Reed canary grass does. But garlic mustard, which has its defenses, its allelopathic defenses, we didn't see either or, either an increase or a decrease in other invasives. So at least from our macro perspective, that's still in question. It's a topic that I love as well, invasional meltdown, and it'd be good for us to take our research, continue exploring that direction as well. I know it's been found in localized studies. I mean, it's foundational part of invasion ecology, but yes.
Thank you so much. You have so much insight on everything. I'm going to leave it in the chat there. Those questions are like, I love how you have research and that you're thinking about it. There is one question from Robin, the resources that are available for the average person, but a little bit more like generally friendly resources for the average person, because they work in backyard conservation, and it'd be great to have citizen science and keeping an eye out for those incoming invaders. If you have resources.
I do. First off, the Invasive Species Center has some resources. So I'm going to plug the Invasive Species Center first. But second, I am going to plug really quickly the sources where we got fact sheets for invasive plants, and where we got the traits data from, because it is really accessible, easy, like snippets of information about each species. So hang on, can I share my screen really quickly so that they can see that list? Okay. All right. Here it is. Okay, so share. All right, so these sources here, Cavi Compendium, which might be behind a paywall, it might not, depending on the species. But the North Carolina State Extension Plant Toolbox, fantastic. UC Berkeley, Jepson Herbarium, very good. The U.S. Forest Service Fire Effects Information System, that one is a lot longer for each species. They'll give you a lot of information though. And U of Michigan Climbers, I want to also plug Missouri Botanical Gardens also has their like fact sheets from the Botanic Gardens. I don't know if they're an extension unit or something, but those are, Google them. They're online, free, available for everyone. Great information.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I'll just share my screen lastly here to conclude our presentation. Again, I did put the email in the chat. Is it okay if I say it out loud as well? gnm@uic.edu. So awesome. Tons of thank you. Thank you, everyone. M shared in the chat the Ontario Grow Me Instead guide. So if you're a horticulturalist, backyard gardener, just type in Ontario grow me instead. Depending if you're in like southern or northern, there's species that would be listed as invasive, and then you have the native alternative. So that's one resources. But yeah, thank you so much, Gabriela Nunez-Mir, for presenting today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This webinar is recorded. It is posted to the YouTube channel, so be sure to look for that in the webinar series. And take a couple minutes afterwards, there's going to be a survey, so that would be greatly appreciated to fill out. And then next month, so our webinar would be on sea lamprey in the Great Lakes on July 22nd, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So stay tuned. Yeah, thank you so much, Gabby, everyone else.
Thank you.